Doing myself here, I thought the dialogue was, two or more people talking. So this is a monologue, actually, and it's important that distinction is there because I started basically as a playwright. So things like monologues, dialogues, I'm a bit anal about that. So I'd rather stand than sit, or would you rather me sit? I'll just stand. So it's like stand-up comedy, but it's not. Wow. So I got an email a few weeks ago from an old friend, Nines, and she invited me here. And I'll never say no to a pretty lady, which is why I married to one. Nikki, right over there. Yes. Now let me segue to the meat of things. Wow. I was asked to talk about passion and writing, and somehow managed to cover in the span of 10 to 15 minutes my writing life, how I started, etc. Good try. Okay? Normally when I'm invited to these things, I'm warned ahead of time that there will probably be like an Oscar Awards or something like that. Some person at the back will raise a red card that says, 5 minutes left. So the pretty ladies, the three graces, if I'm about to go over time, just start gesticulating wildly and I'll wrap up. Alright. So, how to start? I would say that I owe a lot to my mother because she was the one who was responsible for opening the trap door from underneath my feet when I was a very young child of around 7 or 8. And that trap door, when it opened, it led to worlds of wonder. It was because of my mother and her collection of fairy tales, her collection of anthologized short stories that I started to read. And it was because of those books that I found myself exploring all sorts of different places. And my imagination was fire, and there was, at that point in time, no turning back. From the fairy tales and folk tales and all sorts of other stories, I became a rather voracious reader. I would have breakfast, but I would need to have something to read. A newspaper, the back of a milk or juice carton, anything. I need to read. Then another love of my life appeared, and that was the comic book. So comic books came, and it was the four-color wonder and sci-fi and fantasy of it all. From there, it was a quick jump now to the novels. The very first novel I read was by Michael Crichton. It was The Great Train Robbery. After that, it was a very sexy novel, which we will not talk about because it's mixed company. But that was, when you are in the hothouse of adolescence, reading a sexy novel sort of, wow, oh my goodness, right? But my true love, my true passion was fantasy novels. And during the time that I was growing up, there was no fully book, there was no online ordering from Amazon.com, nothing that you could pirate in .mobi files to whisper sync to your Kindle, nothing like that. You had to go look for the books. So I thought myself lucky if I could somehow manage to eke out a trip to Olongapo or somewhere in Pampanga, where the Americans used to be based, and they would have tons of books. And I would devour those dog-eared books, the Asimovs and the Heinleins and all of those things. I loved them. I was also at the complete mercy of the buyers of National Bookstore. At that point in time, you'd be lucky if they had like half a shelf of fantasy. And it was, I'm sorry to say, pardon my French, really crappy selections. Because they're not readers at that time. At least that's my accusatory thought at that point in time. They had only the bestsellers and none of them were finely written. It took a while before I managed to find Ursula Le Guin, all these other writers that later made quite a dent in my writing psyche. Because of fantasy and comic books and fairy tales and folklore and my insatiable appetite, I devoured and devoured and devoured until there came a point in time that demand outran supply. There was nothing left that I could read. Not because there was nothing in the world, but because in my reach, very limited at that point in time, walang internet, nothing like that, no pirate, anything. There was nothing. So I entered a drought. Now, droughts can be looked upon as good or bad things. I choose to look upon it as a good thing. Why? During my period of drought, when my favorite genres were not available, the fact that I was still a voracious reader who would still read the back of a juice carton, okay, it came back with a vengeance. And I had to make do with anything. So I hit the stacks, the library, the magazines. I ended up reading all sorts of things. And I'm all the better for it. No. But I still had my loyalty and my love. I would still look for those things. But yes, I read the romances. Yes, I read non-fiction. Yes, I read the encyclopedias. Time Life owes me a lot because I propped up their business during the lean years. Anyway, when I got to college, I was, my mind was blown again because I met people who had read not just the things I read, but other things also. And there was a lot of sharing of books. So with my mind open, I realized that, my goodness, there's this world of literature that is amazing. But still, I wanted a fantasy. So what was I to do? At that point in time, the seeds started to be planted within me that I would later sow. And that led me along the path of a transformation from a consumer to a producer. Ultimately, to shortcut the story, I decided that there will come a point in my life where I will write these stories that I long to read. And I will only write stories that I will read. So I need to be sneaky about it. Because I'm so selective when it comes to my fiction. I won't just, I'm lying, I'd read anything. But if I had a choice, I
read ketchup bottles.
My wife knows I read ketchup bottles. So very interesting. Because they lie. Okay, anyway. About your health content. But anyway. So, what happened? I realized I had an ear for dialogue. So, I started to hang around people, and I realized that there's this nice cadence. And since I loved stories from youth, I realized that people were telling stories all the time. So it became a matter of listening and stealing. It's really theft, because it's not yours, it's not your life, but you can creatively rework it, remold it, and you're able to create something different. Hence, I started my path, my writerly path. I started as a playwright. I started writing plays in my teens. Eventually, the first award I won, since Nance was so interested about these things, the first Palanca award I won was for a play. I was 20 or 21 years. And I remember that night attending the Palanca Awards because I was starstruck. For us writers in Manila, or in the Philippines rather, it's like going to the Oscar Awards and then you see Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie and the Battalion of Adopted Children going on there. And I realized, hey, all these writers are cool, but a dim, dark epiphany struck me. I have not read any of them. What am I doing? Why am I reading from outside when clearly there is something here? So, I was triggered and I started to look at stuff that was produced in our country. And you know what? It saddened me. Because the output of what would later be called speculative fiction, and I'll define that in a bit, was severely limited. What is speculative fiction? Speculative fiction, or spec-fic, is the umbrella term that we use to describe genre stories. Fantasy, science fiction, horror, magical realism or marvelous realism, interstitial fiction, genre. These are normally found anywhere but in the Philippines. At least you would think that. But the fact is, we are a storytelling nation. We are a storytelling people. Okay? For every Lord of the Rings or whatever book you have there, we have our folk tales. And we have all sorts of heroic and wonder tales all over the archipelago. For everything that Stephen King and now his son, Joe Hill, okay, produces in terms of horror. He looks like this guy. Okay, close kami. Okay? We have all sorts of stories of horror. Creatures of the underworld. Ato ng mga tiyanak and manananggal and all of these things. We have deep, deep horror roots all over the place. So we covered that. Science fiction. The Filipinos also write science fiction. But granted, it is not necessarily of the kind that you would expect coming from the Western world. As for the other genres, 2 minutes, my goodness. Okay, so that's what spec-fic is. Alright, moving along. Okay, I decided that I would write this. And I decided that I would do it immediately. So I started writing. And then guess what? There's no market. No one would publish it. So I skip ahead. Why do I want to get published? Who doesn't want to get published? If you're a writer, you want to get published. Why? Why then are you writing for yourself? No, you want your stories to be read also. Because that's how you grow and develop. Okay? Besides, all my favorite writers, I access them because they got published. So I want to be published too. I decided to get published. It's hard. There's no market. People didn't know what this thing was. In Manila, in the Philippines in particular, the dominant mode is domestic realism and social realism. It has to do with Carabaos and the NPA fighting there, and social injustice and all that. And don't get me wrong, this is very important. This is part of our culture. Do not allow anyone to say otherwise. But certainly there is space also for stories of hope, stories of wonder, stories of imagination, stories that would appeal to a lot of people. So, jumping again because I now have less than a minute left. Okay, I decided I would keep trying here, but I also started submitting abroad. Now, it's brutal abroad because you're not just competing with your friends or people here in Manila. You're competing with big-time writers. Eventually, after a couple of rejections, I got published in the year's best fantasy and horror. Who had also published Isabel Allende, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Stephen King. So, wow! I was so happy. So, for me, that became like a banner because it was inspirational for me. Then, I wanted to infect my friends like zombies. And I pushed and I prodded and I persuaded a lot of people because if one person can do it, then two, and if two, then three, and three, then you do the math. Eventually, I decided, you know what? The market is harsh. I'll put up an anthology, Philippine speculative fiction. Send out a call over my blog. Filipinos from all over the world, from Europe, US, different parts, submitted stories. Okay, we had a lot of stories. How many in specfic one? 150, 200 stories, something like that. Okay, and we only had room to publish 20. Right? So that we are now in our 6th volume. So, I guess what I want to tell you is, if you want something and you're willing to work, and you're willing to accept the fact that you may stumble, in fact you will, and hurt your knees and your back, but accept also that if you pick yourself up, chances are, and there's no guarantee in life, chances are eventually you'll get to where you're going. If you subscribe to that, then the writing life is for you. However, I am not like Nines that my life is purely supported by writing. I wish I can't. So, I had to do other stuff. So, I run a couple of businesses. It supports my, it supports my writing. But, I do have a dream. I dream that in the future, there will be creative writers. Writers who peddle their wares and fiction and stories, and there will be enough of a market to support them and their lives so that they in turn can keep creating more and keep all the Filipino imagination juiced up, moving to the future. So that's it. I'll be happy to answer questions later. Good night.